Every once in a while, I'll manage to come across something, and it just catches my fancy, and I don't expect it's going to be probably something that everybody happened to see. But I just was looking through. I get a daily email from one of our state newspapers, and it comes with all sorts of headlines about news, but also the opinion pages, and sometimes the things I see on the opinion pages, including the letters from readers. This is from the Idaho Press Tribune, and it's from a woman by the name of Sandra Kirshner. She's from Caldwell. And I saw the headline and I thought, oh, this sounds interesting, and it certainly was. The headline is Other Causes for Global Warming. And I don't normally read an entire letter. I'm going to read a great deal of this, though, because I can't tell if she's being serious or if she's being facetious to make another point. But I wanted to share it because it's one of the best letters. If it's facetious, it's one of the best letters I've seen in a very, very long time. It's coming up on 8 minutes after 9 o'clock, 80. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. A little later, too, I want to mention a couple of events that are coming up. Of course, I've been sharing some emails this morning with Anna Workman from of course, she's been the organizer of Patriots Night. That's taking place tomorrow night, and that'll be and I think there might be just a handful of tickets left, taking place tomorrow night at the Performing Arts Center at the College of Southern Idaho. And Madison Rising is going to be performing there, which is, of course, one of the most popular rock bands in the country today. And the mistress of ceremonies is Miss Idaho, our own Kaylee Wright, and she's going to be in attendance as well. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, I got passed along this. I love this thing. This is a well put together. The people who got behind this nice glossy schedule about some of the free fishing days being sponsored by Idaho Fish and Game. Well, on Friday, because a lot of people have Friday off, there's going to be a free fishing day, and that's taking place at the Village Pond in Elkhorn. Starts at 8 o'clock in the morning when it's still cool out until noon. We never liked to fish in hot weather when I was a kid. It was always believed that fish wouldn't bite. But then they're in the water below, and how would they know how hot it is unless there was some sort of inversion? But again, on Friday, that's taking place, Village Pond in Elkhorn. Bring the kids out for this between 8 o'clock and noon. A lot of people have that day off. So here's this letter that I happened to look at this morning, and I thought, I got to share this. The writer says, the leading experts in global warming, and she puts experts in quotes and global warming in quotes, are failing to put anywhere near the appropriate amount of blame on things other than carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels to heat our homes, run our cars and trucks, tractors, and our manufacturing plants. The writer goes on to say comparatively little is put on all the planes, ships, and trains used for transporting people and goods from one country to another. Comparatively little on the ever-growing number of buildings and sidewalks, paved roads, and highways, their construction and upkeep as well as existence, all the rocket ships being fired into space, all the wars, the use of weapons, the explosions and fires they create, all the wildfires, forest and grassland, less and less water flowing into the ocean because of irrigation, and the water that does make it through being much warmer because of dams. Because of the reservoirs these dams create, the melting of ice at the poles, which changes the Earth's axis, all the volcanoes on land and the sea, the heat they put off, and the carbon dioxide eruptions release. And she goes on to write, very little blame is put on the amount of heat lightning releases when it, and I'm reading this directly, whether it's grammatically correct or its syntax might be a little fractured. Very little blame is put on the amount of heat lightning releases when it streaks through our skies, and none to the amount which the electricity we use, wind, water, and atomic energy to create, helps produce. And then the writer says, little, if any, is put on the heat humans and animals put off. I had a big bag of popcorn this morning just before I got on air. Keeps people out of the studio, if you know what I mean. The carbon dioxide their breath produces, little, if any, of the carbon dioxide given off by decaying animal and vegetable matter, foods and drinks that involve fermentation, and by carbonated beverages. Heat from fireworks is never mentioned. And the writer says, why is the Pope and our president backing these experts? Sandra Kirshner, Caldwell. And I read that, and at first I thought, she's serious. But the more I read it, the more I thought she's being very tongue-in-cheek, pointing out that, all of our big SUVs are destroying the planet. But what she's pointing out is, if you've got an economy, a worldwide economy, you've got to have ships and trains, and you've got to be moving people around. And then she talks about, the things we've had for a long time in a place like Idaho. The irrigation is 100 years old, if not older. And she breaks this down. And when she starts talking about people's breath and heat from fireworks and the like, I nearly got tears in my eyes when I first read this. I was laughing so hard because if she's trying to make a point about how silly all of this is and beyond our control, she's just done that. It's 12 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you, 80. And, of course, our telephone number, if you'd like to reach Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 736-0300. You're up next. You're on the air.
Yeah, good morning, Bill. Well, all of the United Nations climate models, there's been 73 different models, and there's 0 for 73. All 73 of them have been wrong. And, there's only 800 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, but there's 40,000 gigatons in the ocean. So it's not CO2 drives the temperature, it's temperature that drives the CO2. So they got it 180 degrees wrong. This is all about control from the United Nations Agenda 21 being implemented through the EPA. And until we stop the EPA, stop funding it, and hammer on our people to stop funding that, bureaucracy that's unscientific, we're just going to be paying higher and higher. They want to do away with not only coal, but natural gas now. I mean, all of our energy is under attack.
And we are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. This country is sitting on huge volumes of it. We have the technology to get it. It's cheap. It's clean burning, supposedly, right? They're worried about the extraction. They're worried about the extraction process. They're not worried about the actual burning of the gas. And even the EPA, which we know is controlled by a lot of people who are simply just Marxist-Leninists, has concluded that fracking is not a serious environmental threat.
Well, absolutely. And so the whole idea is the bottom line is they want to make a third world country out of us. And how do you do that? By making energy expensive.
Yeah, and we're going to be, from what I read this morning in Washington Examiner, increasing the subsidies for solar, or not solar, but rather wind power. And I drove to Boise 2 weeks ago, and I just was looking at all of those things sitting out there. And yeah, they're spinning sometimes, but I can't imagine that we can power an entire state off what they've got out there.
Well, I mean, all of this wind and solar right now is less than 5%, nationwide. And the wind don't blow all the time. Certainly the sun's not all the time. And we have no real storage a system unless the Tesla people can come up with something that's inexpensive to be able to store more solar and what have you. But yeah, without the subsidies, wind and solar would go away because they're not self-sustaining.
I thank you much for the call, and not self-sustaining because simply they can't produce. If you look at all of those giant pinwheels that are blowing out there along the highway, if you drive down 84, up 84, whatever direction I guess you'd be going, you're driving along and you see all those things. First of all, gosh, this beautiful landscape we have, and all of a sudden you've got these giant pinwheels spinning around and round and round out there. If they're spinning at all, some days it's not that windy. But how many of those would you literally need to put up to meet the needs of our first world economy? Because what the caller just made a great point. I was having a conversation on a radio show years ago with Ann Coulter. And one of the rare moments I actually got off a wittier remark than she did when I said something along the lines of, countries that go with all of these alternatives have a name, and that's third world. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story, News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And what's on your mind?
Well, here's a good one for you, Bill. I go to Wyoming quite a bit, and over there across Wyoming, they have a lot of those windmills over there, and they're just promote the windmills and wind farms and all of that good stuff. But here a year ago, they decided that they were killing eagles and hawks, and the federal government sued windmill farms for $1 million for killing their birds.
Federal government just taking back all the money it gave these people to start the windmill farm, huh?
Well, you got to get it back somehow.
Hey, thank you much for the telephone call. And one of the other worries, bats. Bats, of course, we've had bat die-offs, more so than we've had bee die-offs. You keep hearing about bees dying off, and yet the next year they'll bounce back whenever there's a major die-off. Turns out it's actually caused by some bacteria. It's not actually caused by the, quote, stress we put the bees under. I love that one. Stressed bees. Look, when I was a kid, we'd go out and we'd take a PVC pipe, big long PVC pipe, and we'd knock down their nests. Yeah, they were stressed, but then they would go rebuild their nests afterwards. And by the time they were done, then we figured we could come back outside because they may have forgotten us by that point. But I got to tell you something. The bats that fly, and many of these bats, they have these ancient routes they've been flying in their migrations for long before we were here. And we put up these giant pinwheels, and these pinwheels, they create a draft behind them. Anything that big sweeping through the air is going to create some sort of draft. They have discovered that if bats are flying nearby, so it's not just the birds that are being killed, but the bats come flying by, and it literally collapses their lungs, that draft that's created, and the bats die, sometimes by the tens of thousands along their flight paths near these things. And the environmentalists are telling us that this is still, that they're doing the cost benefit and saying this is still better. Look, the people in California are dying of thirst because the government is dumping water into the bays so they can protect a couple of guppies. And yet, it's okay to kill all the bats and the birds? Hello? Why are the guppies more important than these other animals? And the bats, if you know, I just was reading this morning on our website, there has been a discovery of West Nile virus, not far away from where we're located, and that's of course because of the spread of it. It gets spread by mosquitoes. Well, hey folks, bats eat mosquitoes, and they love them. I mean, it's like a delicacy for a bat. If you lose the bats because of the dang windmills, then you're going to have more mosquitoes and more West Nile virus. But I guess the liberals will like that because if we all die off from West Nile, then they can save the planet. Now, if this woman is serious about her letter, and again, I think she's just being tongue-in-cheek, but if she's serious and she's that self-loathing about what we're doing on this planet, here's a solution. All of you granola-chomping, tree-hugging, Volvo-driving liberals out there, I got a thought for all of you. Simply go off yourselves. You've got to be numbered worldwide in a couple of billion, right? I mean, at least out of Americans, maybe the extremists on the left have to be 80 to 100 million. Well, that would help the planet if you all suddenly went away. Just think about that. And around the world, if a couple of billion of you would greatly reduce the surplus population. If you are that self-loathing, then just get rid of yourselves. Save the planet. And then the rest of us can pick up the pieces. Line 20. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And since, you don't, I can't do that. My religious faith, which I do take seriously, frowns on that sort of thing. But since most of you don't have any, actual belief in God, it's all about, Mother Nature or Gaia or whatever you call it, then you don't have any of those, you wouldn't be put in a moral quandary by just going out and jumping into the ocean and drowning yourself. And by the way, then all of those endangered sharks could finish off your carcasses, so you'd be doing a double favor for everyone. We've got plenty more ahead. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. Oh, dope legal in Oregon. A lot of dopes there anyway, but now it's legal. We'll talk about that if we get an opportunity coming up in a short while, speaking of a sacrament of the American left. Well, when it's already 80 degrees during the course of the show in the morning, we know it's going to be a hot one. And that means it's likely going to be hot when you go out after work today to get in the car. Since it's not been raining lately, I've been just going out and leaving the sunroof partially open so the heat has somewhere to vent as it pours through the windows. But I actually have some tinted windows in the Jeep, and that really helps out. So window tint, if you did not know this, can reduce the heat that comes through those windows by almost 3/4. That's a fact. That comes from Tint Lady of Idaho, and they would highly recommend, if you're looking to stay cool and you're looking to keep that air conditioning unit working maybe not quite so hard this summer and saving on some electricity costs, that you give them a call, because they can actually tint automobiles, they can tint your home, they can tint your workplace. They do this, and they've been doing it for over 20 years. Locally owned and operated. You can get a free estimate. If you'd like to call and make an appointment, they'll come out and they'll do that estimate. Telephone number 736-8469. Or you can get in touch with them online at tintladyidaho.com. They're located at 1887 Highland Avenue East in Twin Falls. Hours Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Saturday by appointment only. Closed on Sundays. And, of course, the phrase, it's a great phrase, don't squint, get tint. That from Tint Lady. If you want to give them a call, I think it's a great idea because, hey, look, we still got a couple of hot months ahead of us this summer. They'll help things. They'll cool you down, believe me. It's 8:25, 9:25. Excuse me, I'm getting behind myself again. 81 at our studios, and you're listening to Bill Colley on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And you're up next. You're on the air.
Yeah, good day, mate. I guess I've been accused of being one of those tree huggers, but you're on a subject near and dear to my heart. One of the reasons I'm here in your country is because of a lot of things that you blokes do right. And it wasn't that long ago in the Western United States it was all right to shoot golden eagles. Of course, we've all realized they have our ways and they do good and eat the jackrabbits and whatnot. And then the environmental president, Mr. Obama, your president, I guess I get to say that because I'm just a guest. He went off and said, well, I'll tell you what, if they run into windmills, that's all right. Now, you blokes, they might take a lamb or two. You can't shoot them as you used to. But if they run into the windmill, that's all right because, well, they're saving the planet and we'll sacrifice them. And I take this up with my mates and I say, don't you see the hypocrisy? And they don't. Well, he's trying to do good. He's trying to do good. Well, I say, the things don't pencil out. They don't pencil out down under, by the way, either. We've got lots of coal. They don't pencil out here. I hate the bloody things. They kill birds. They make everything a wildlife desert. And I'm spot on with you. I think what they ought to do with those eyesores. The other thing is, from what I understand, all of the power doesn't go to you. It goes out of state.
Well, and I recognize that when I send my my payments to Idaho Power in Seattle, that a lot of these utilities certainly have footprints, and even though they identify themselves in subgroups by representing certain states and the like, they're actually working on a much more regional basis. And of course, the object is there's just a lot of wind out here, and so the feeling is you can sell this power, and some of these states are obligated to buy it.
Yeah, that's just it. That's why everybody. They don't pencil out because when they produce their peak power is exactly when no one needs it. From what I understand, I was told that if we had wind demand met, the peak demand was sometime in the middle of February when the wind was howling 90 or nothing. But there's no demand here. There's no irrigation. Nobody's running the irrigation pump in February. Nobody's running their air conditioning. Yeah, true, you got a heat pump, but from what I understand, it doesn't take that much. So I hate the bloody things. I consider myself, I suppose, I don't even like the term environmentalist. I'm just a smart bloke that would like to see open space and green things, and I'd like to go take a bird or two or a deer or two with my gun, and let's call it good. I'm not sure what that makes me a conservationist, I guess. But keep up the good work because I hate the bloody things. I can't stand them here, and I sure can't stand them down under.
Thank you much for the call. Well said. I remember years ago, I was working on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, and there were all of these ideas they were coming up with to build them offshore. And yet you've got all these resort communities that, if it wasn't for people coming to the beaches, there wouldn't be an economy. I mean, you could grow more chickens, I guess. And then the chickens, the nitrogen runoff from all of the byproduct fouls the bays anyway. But they wanted to build these things, and they came in and they threw out this huge subsidy to this company called Blue Water Wind. And then within a few years, the Blue Water Wind just folded its tents. Nothing was ever built, although the people who actually provided Blue Water Wind with the contract and some of the subsidies, they managed to do very well when it came to collecting contributions for their political campaigns from the environmentalists and the people who were associated with Blue Water Wind, which I think was what that was really all about. But they decided to put one of these things up as a demonstration model, and one day a friend of mine, he was an oil engineer, he said, "You're aware, aren't you, that it's not windy right now, but that thing's spinning?" And I said, "You're kidding, right?" And he said, "No, they had to put a little motor in that to keep it spinning to give the impression it was doing its job for public relations purposes." 81 930, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Well, starting today, marijuana is legal in Oregon. I suspect that it's legal because just the voting public in Portland, Salem, and Eugene were able to overwhelm everyone else in the state, or at least put the pressure on legislators to make this change. Now, this is nothing I've ever been shy about saying. I don't care if you smoke marijuana. It's not for me. I don't have any interest in doing it. But I don't care if somebody else is doing it, and I'm well aware that we still don't know because no one has ever really done a whole heck of a lot of research on this. There were some guys I went to high school with, and they were just simply running test patterns between their ears, and we used to think it was because of the marijuana smoking. But then they may have been running the test patterns before they took up the marijuana smoking. And so you remember those from the early days of TV before we had 24/7, television. You'd go to bed at night after the news had finished. They'd play the national anthem, and then there'd be a test pattern would come up, and it would just be a sound of the background, and then it'd just be this, collection of shapes on the TV screen, and it would stay that way until about 6 o'clock in the morning. And then all of a sudden, the national anthem would. I grew up in a city on the border, or near a city on the border with Canada. So you actually had two national anthems that would play, one at closing and one at opening. But they've decided to go ahead with this. See, we don't know again the long-term effects because no one has ever really delved into it. Now, I can't sit here and complain about that though because, I got up last Saturday morning and I made myself a pot of coffee and I drank it all, the entire pot. And then Sunday morning, I not only finished the entire pot, but then I brewed a couple of more cups and I drank those. So, I'm well aware that a lot of things we do can have what they call a deleterious effect on us. This is a policeman from Bend, Oregon. He is talking about the situation and says, well, there's going to be some fireworks, not just from 4th of July.
Extra law enforcement officers will be on patrol on the 4th of July looking specifically for driving unimpaired drivers under the influence, public use of marijuana, those types of things. Ready or not, here it comes.
And then this morning, hey, get this. One of our state's newspapers here in Idaho actually published where you can go buy the stuff. But on the other hand, if you buy the stuff in Oregon and you bring it back to Idaho, then you're breaking the law in Idaho, right? So that would mean if the newspaper is telling you where to go buy it, which it is, then you'll have to smoke it before you then drive back to Idaho, which means you're going to be driving back to Idaho gooned out of your mind. And this newspaper is a party to this, I would think, by saying, hey, psst, here's where you can go buy the stuff. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story 936-81, and what's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, Bill. Hey, that last caller, I just love his accent and his common sense from Australia. They say I have a funny accent because I'm from Texas, but that guy's got so much common sense, it's unreal. I would love to meet him.
Well, Texans do too, right?
Yes.
I've only been to Texas twice in my life, and both times I flew into San Antonio, so I've not
beautiful.
been anywhere else. But I went out the second visit, and I went out and spent a week at the Guadalupe River Ranch, which was Olivia de Havilland's old ranch. It is now a conference center.
Right.
The last time I went horseback riding, and the land out there in Boerne, Texas, is a lot like the land here.
Right.
Some sagebrush and tumbleweed and the like. But it was beautiful. We had a fire one night. We all went outside. This was March, and the days were hot, but we all went outside at night. We had to put on our winter coats and sat around the fire. I loved it there. In fact, I have a dream of eventually, if I can ever retire, of going back to Boerne, Texas. Plus, you're only half an hour, 35 minutes from downtown San Antonio if you'd like that part of it, too.
I love San Antonio. That whole area is just unreal. But, yeah, that man from Australia, I just love hearing him call you.
That's another place I'd like to visit, but
Me
when
too.
I check into the plane costs,
Right.
the flight costs.
Right. Okay, thanks, Bill.
Hey, thank you much for the telephone call. And I just Texas itself, because of the sheer size of the place, there's, and of course they have huge metropolitan areas, but in between, you have a lot of these beautiful small towns. I have a friend from high school. She is living in Plano, which is not too far from Fort Worth, and she's been there. Plano's now a huge city too, as well. She's been there for about 30 years, and some other friends who've come and gone from there. And then when I was working on a U.S. Senate campaign in Michigan last year, I was working with a political action committee. There was an entire family from Texas. They homeschooled their children so they could come and they could do this. They were from Texas as well, and I would go door-to-door campaigning with them, and my gosh, the stories they would tell about growing up there and how beautiful it is. Yeah, I got to tell you, I think it's just for a vacation. I wouldn't mind going back there for about 2 weeks. You're on the air with Bill Colley coming up on our break, but you've got time, I think, to squeeze something out.
Hello, Bill. This is Pat.
Yes.
And I had a friend that I grew up with, and he got into using marijuana, and he smoked his whole inheritance and all his farm and everything away. And he said, you get up in the morning, I'll just have one joint. And he said, all of a sudden it was nighttime. They can say what they want, but it takes away all incentives to do better things.
And in that time, 12 hours from bedtime, from waking up to bedtime, probably seemed to this guy like weeks had passed when you consider how it alters your perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, it just said you start out with one joint, next you know it's nighttime, and everything was lost from it. And they can say what they want, but that's a pretty sad state to put your life in.
I would say so. Steve Martin used to tell a joke about how, well, I'd occasionally smoke some after dinner. Well, all right, maybe a little bit before dinner. Sometimes, maybe immediately after lunch. Oh, and sometimes just before lunch, and sometimes right after breakfast. He was explaining when he had that habit when he was young and then managed to get out of it. 9:40. Hey, 20 minutes left. Rush Limbaugh coming up after 10 o'clock news. I was just looking at the television monitor, and there was a story out of Greece where they're saying that in a matter of days they could run out of just basic goods people need for survival. I think of talking groceries. I think, it's not just, gasoline supplies. And of course the banks are closed for a week, and they have not been able to come to some sort of settlement on a bailout plan. And by the way, some of the people at MSNBC have been arguing the banks are being cruel to Greece, but as it turns out, the socialist premier, he had sort of ignored the banks, didn't want to have any dealings with them for a long time as things were getting out of hand. People are finally, I think, around the world starting to realize that we've got a serious problem. It's not just Greece. Even the New York Times, which, they've been so more concerned talking about social issues, LGBT and gay, and marriage. Let me tell you something. No culture around the world, to my knowledge, has ever collapsed because Johnny and Jimmy couldn't get married. On the other hand, when it comes to debt problems, that's a much more serious issue. But even the New York Times printed this yesterday, loads of debt, a global ailment with few cures. In other words, it's not just Greece, it's a lot of people, and the debt is so massive in most places, there's just simply no way it can be managed. I sent that link to that story to a friend of mine. He's not a big fan of the New York Times by any means, but I sent the link to him so he could take a look at it yesterday, and he's been very shrewd when it comes to markets, and he's not in any debt, and he's essentially able to live off the grid, and he's been able to pay cash when he needs to. He doesn't borrow. He's tried to make sure that he's stayed healthy well into his 60s so he can stay out of the healthcare system and the like. And he responded this morning, and I wanted to share some of what he had to say. He said the cure for the debt is for the people to ignore it and go about their business trading with each other. And he recommends that we grow things locally, that we buy our groceries locally from local growers. He recommends that, we've and some places are starting to do this. Small communities are starting to make their own clothes and sell to their neighbors, but it's very much at a nascent stage at the moment. He writes, the debt has been incurred unlawfully, yet with the implied consent of the citizens. He says, all that is required is for the sudden realization that the debt is nothing more than two things. Number one, he writes, the sum total of interest, overhead, and profit earned by the Fed on each dollar they have managed, currently 12.5%, he writes, on each unit of currency produced and distributed. Now remember, folks, the Federal Reserve is not actually a product of the federal government. It is a separate entity. It's called the Federal Reserve. It's not, though. These are independent banks. There's just a handful of them. Number two, he writes, the sum total of money that has been lost by international banks through betting on derivatives held solely between the banks and not in any way held by or with the people. In other words, the banks themselves are responsible for any debt that exists. The only possible thing we citizens may be liable for is for the fees charged by the Fed since 1914, and if it was investigated far enough, these would have been attained fraudulently and therefore would negate our obligation. And he says, as long as we pay taxes to the federal government, the charade will continue. He says, I'll go out on a limb here. Judging by the speed and intensity that the current administration is taking down our systems, we will be finding out by October 1st the way that Greece now feels. And so, there have been a number of people. I just was reading where a major investor the other day is warning people that we've got a bubble in the markets, and he's staying out. He's advising other people to do the same thing. Holman W. Jenkins Jr. writing at the Wall Street Journal, why Greece puts a gun to its head. And he says the Greeks had all the leverage to lead their own resurrection. I'm thumbing through this and just giving you a couple of sentences. But Mr. Tsipras, that's the prime minister, shriekingly insisted that Europe go on subsidizing Greece so Greece wouldn't have to change. He effectively put a gun to Greece's head and said, quote, pay us ransom or the idiot gets it, unquote. Remember that scene in Blazing Saddles? Cleavon Little holds the gun up to his head and starts doing the different voices. Hey, I'll get back or the gets it. Yeah, similar to that. The idiot is now getting it, according to Mr. Jenkins. Greece's banking system and government are running out of cash because Mr. Tsipras spurned loans that the EU, European Union for you public school graduates, frankly was quite eager to give. The Greek people will likely vote overwhelmingly to stay in the euro in next week's referendum, but by then it may be too late. And he says Mr. Tsipras likely will be propagating a stab-in-the-back myth to blame Europe for rejecting Greece, not the other way around. So, you throw that in and you throw the debt in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, we should note, has been controlled by Democrats for decades. Not that I'm saying that one party is any better than the other. I'm pretty peeved with the other major party, too, as well. But the Democrats have run Puerto Rico now for decades. They had to know at some point, and Greece is the same way. You go blowing all this money on political promises to get reelected, and then when you can't pay the tab when it's due, then you go hand in hand to somebody else and say, bail me out. So U.S. taxpayers are going to be bailing out Puerto Rico. Possibly U.S. taxpayers will also help bail out Greece, although that's mainly a European problem. But as my friend says, by October 1st, we may be looking at, I heard an interview the other day, and it was very subtle. Brett Baer talking with Bobby Jindal about the $19 trillion in debt. Well, not long ago, it was $18 trillion in U.S. official debt. And not long before that, it was $17 trillion. Now it's $19 trillion. It's expected to go to $26 trillion in a few years. And then who knows where it ends. Mike Gallagher, by the way, is next, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. You can reach them by calling 736-6563. Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher. Hey, I was just thinking, we were talking about Greece in the last segment of the show, and I would bet that next week you can get a bargain vacation. Actually, if you're looking for some waterfront property, or if you're looking for maybe a home on an island, and they have a lot of islands there, I would bet it's a buyer's market. My brother lived in Bulgaria many, many years ago, and I remember about 15 years ago, he was talking with me. He said, if you wanted to move here, he said, you could buy the nicest house in town for $35,000. The problem is it's in Bulgaria. He was in a place called Kazanblak, which is a little bit off the beaten path. 954-82. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 736-0300, and you're on the air.
You noticed that our two senators and congressmen just voted for fast track. One of these two trade agreements economically ties us with the EU. And so we'll probably be involved in, bailing out Greece and these other countries that have way overspent, as if we're not already bankrupt ourselves. But, that's something to keep in mind. Only 5 of the 29 chapters had to do with trade, and that was the thing that was promoted. But the other 24 have to do with economic and political merger, including putting us under foreign tribunals as far as our court system. Pretty scary stuff.
If you recall, too, Marco Rubio voted for this thing, and yet he'll be making all the noise about Cuba in the next few days because of the embassy reopening there. And yet he's turning over a lot of our own sovereignty to a larger entity, well, not maybe larger, but a more nefarious entity at the UN.
Well, absolutely, and it's just crazy. These trade agreements have always been one-sided. We end up on the short end of the stick on all of them, and NAFTA cost us 1 million jobs, and 40,000 factories moved to Canada and Mexico overseas. So, I mean, they're just got to be. This thing's got to be stopped. Let's put the pressure on our people. Thank you.
Hey, thank you much for the call too as well. Ted Cruz, by the way, ended up voting against this treaty. He said I plan to support it, but when he actually saw the pages that were released by WikiLeaks got its hands on them. They got leaked. And Cruz said when he read those, he was just appalled. He said, "Wait a second." My leaders over in the Senate have been telling me, "Don't worry, no, trade agreement, good, free trade, wonderful." He said, but then I'm looking through all of this, and I saw that, and I said to myself, nope, this isn't quite what I think I want to be involved with. So good for him. He voted no. He, by the way, hey, on a lighter note, could we end with this today? This is from Fox. Ted Cruz has applied to become one of the voices on The Simpsons.
Ted Cruz released a video saying that since Harry Shearer isn't returning to The Simpsons, that he would like to audition for a few roles. First up, Smithers.
Smithers, release the hounds. Excellent.
Or how about Ned Flanders?
Idly-ho, neighbor. Oakley-dokley, neighborino.
Cruz even took on family patriarch Homer in a conversation with Lisa. However, the one mirroring Cruz's own life, Alien Kodos Clinton, a presidential candidate on the show.
Forward, not backwards. Upwards, not downwards. And always twirling for freedom.
Al Jean, The Simpsons executive producer, released Cruz's answer in a statement saying he's not getting the part. Michelle Polino, Fox News Radio.
Of course not, because he's not a fellow traveler. And you know the people who put that show out, well, they're equal opportunity bashers when it comes to people in public life. I think we can all pretty much guess where they stand on most of the major issues of the day. And Ted Cruz is not their cup of tea. At least, over at Family Guy, they've had Rush on a couple of times. One of the better episodes they ever did when they did a spoof on Star Wars. And Luke gets thrown into the pit with a monster and the gate opens up. And it's Rush Limbaugh. And Rush comes out and starts giving him a hard time about not paying his taxes. 9:58. You see, the people behind that program, at least, they're willing to, extend an olive branch now and then. Speaking of Rush, he's coming up in just a few minutes. If you heard him yesterday, he mentioned the David Stockman piece, the real unemployment in this country. Real unemployment rate is 42.9%. Ouch. Ouch, ouch. I've signed up for Stockman's blog for that very reason. Rush coming up, following news, and God willing, if the creek don't rise, I get to do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning. Hope to see you then.